Okay, so this is the Bible study for Romans chapter 4. And the text says, "What then shall we say that Abraham, our forefather, according to the flesh, discovered in this matter? If in fact Abraham was justified by works, he had something to boast about, but not before God. What does Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. Now, to the one who works, wages are not credited as a gift, but as an obligation. However, to the one who does not work, but trusts God, who justifies the ungodly, their faith is credited as righteousness." David says the same thing when he speaks of the blessedness of the one to whom God credits righteousness apart from works. Blessed are those whose transgressions are forgiven, whose sins are covered. Blessed is the one whose sin the Lord will never count against them. Is this blessedness only for the circumcised or also for the uncircumcised? We have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. And he received circumcision as a sign, a seal of the righteousness that he had by faith, while he was still uncircumcised. So then, he is the father of all who believe, but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them. And he is then also the father of the circumcised, who not only are circumcised, but who also follow in the footsteps of the faith that our father Abraham had before he was circumcised. It was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir of the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. For if those who depend on the law are heirs, faith means nothing, and the promise is worthless, because the law brings wrath, and where there is no law, there is no transgression. Therefore, the promise comes by faith, so that it may be by grace and may be guaranteed to all Abraham's offspring, not only to those who are the law, but also those who have the faith of Abraham. He is the father of us all, as it is written, "I have made you a father of many nations." He is our father in the sight of God, in whom he believed, the God who gives life to the dead and calls into being things that were not. Against all hope, Abraham in hope believed, and so became the father of many nations, just as it had been said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Without weakening in his faith, he faced the fact that his body was as good as dead, since he was about 100 years old, and that Sarah's womb was also dead. Yet he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. This is why it was credited to him as righteousness. The words "it was credited to him" were written not for him alone, but also for us, to whom God will credit righteousness. For us who believe in him who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead, he was delivered over to death for our sins and was raised to life for our justification. All right. So this is no different from the previous chapters in that it's long and challenging, and Paul is trying to explain something, and therefore is sort of laying out a logical argument to try to help us understand. And this argument is based primarily on what we know about Abraham, and what the people that he was writing to knew about Abraham. And Abraham, one who was lived prior to the giving of the law, and yet was considered righteous. And so he's trying to explain why he was considered righteous and why it was credited to him, um, and how we are like Abraham, as opposed to being like those who came after Abraham and after Moses when the law had been given. and that in being saved by grace through faith, like Abraham, we are then children of Abraham, as opposed to his birth children or those who follow the law, because Abraham was not somebody who even had the law to follow. He just had relationship with God. So remember that you can download this PDF um, at www.abqnaz.org so that you can follow along with us as we study this text. And there's a lot of words in some of these questions and answers. So trying to break this down. Number one, what is the significance of Paul bringing up Abraham in this text? See also Genesis 15. So Genesis 15 is going to describe the story that Paul is referring to. And I can just bring that up here. It's the Lord's covenant with Abram. And so this is what Paul was talking about. So I'm not going to read that here, but I would say that in general, um, I find that even the church, even people that have been in the church for a long time, have a tendency to be somewhat biblically illiterate, not really know what the Bible talks about and teaches, haven't spent a lot of time studying the Bible. If we have studied the Bible, it's been somewhat selective and not sort of in its entirety. And so we often don't know when a New Testament author refers back to something in the Old Testament, we don't know what they're talking about. So I would encourage you to read that text, but I do think that it's going to be difficult for us to do that in a timely fashion here. So I just encourage maybe reading it before you get to Bible study. If our teachers are watching this, they can text the people in their Bible study, read this before you get to Bible study, or maybe read it as you go home to make better understand the story that he's referring to. We can maybe pull out pieces of it that will be helpful, but we're already reading a whole chapter in Romans. It doesn't seem helpful or possible to read also a whole chapter in Genesis, or perhaps more to get better context. So A says Abraham was the father of the Jews. So that's true. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob was the one called Israel, and Israel had 12 sons. And when we talk about Israel and the tribes of Israel, we're talking about the descendants of Jacob and his 12 sons. So Abraham also had some of the neighboring nations to Israel that he called his descendants or close relatives. Um, you know, Jacob's brother Esau made up one of the neighboring nations. We know that Abraham and the story of Lot and Lot's family. Lot was his nephew, I believe, and Lot's family made up a portion of the one of the neighboring nations. But when we talk about the Jews, we're talking about Israel, and Israel were descendants of Jacob, which was Abraham's grandson. And Abraham was considered a father of the faith and of their people. B, everything that the Jews received had been seen as God's fulfillment of the promise that he made to Abraham. That's true. So the Jews' perspective was that all the gifts they received, all the promises they received, was a fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham to take care of his descendants. And so the Jews saw it that way. C, salvation through faith in Jesus Christ should also be seen as the fulfillment of the promise made to Abraham. And that's what Paul is saying here. So Paul is pointing out that it's not just by birth that God's promise is fulfilled to descendants of Abraham, but also those of us who follow in Abraham's footsteps in his faith are considered children of Abraham. And not only that, the fulfillment of the promise. And he says that when he points out that he would be the father of many nations, not just one nation. So the Jews were not the only fulfillment of this promise, because they were essentially one nation, and the promise was that Abraham would be the father of many nations. D, Abraham did not have the law, though he became the father of the Jewish people who came to rely on the law. So that is, I've already kind of mentioned this, but that is a big part of what Paul is trying to point out. So you look to Abraham as your father, and in the next breath, talk about the importance of the law and following the law. But Abraham didn't have the law, and Abraham was considered righteous. It was his faith. He believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. So he was a child of God by faith before he even had the law. And if you say, well, yeah, but maybe he had some elements of the law, he was circumcised, so God gave the covenant of circumcision to him. But Paul points out that Abraham was considered righteous before he was circumcised. So it was credited to him as righteousness because he trusted God. Then he was circumcised because he trusted God. So then he was not righteous because he was circumcised. He was righteous because he trusted God. Then he was circumcised because he trusted God. And that's what Paul is trying to point out. So Abraham was obedient. Abraham followed God's commands, but he did that because he trusted God. And he was considered righteous because he trusted God. And so to it may seem like semantics to some of us. It may seem like this is confusing, but the trust of God is the first thing. And then because of the trust in God, he was considered righteous. It was credited to him as righteousness. And because of the trust in God, he followed God's commands and was circumcised. But he was a child of God because of the trust of God before his obedience. And his obedience was only continued proof of his trust in God. And that's where Paul is trying to take us. So he is not, as some have said. So this is a powerful grace text. When people refer to Romans as sort of the book of grace, that where we understand salvation by grace through faith and not by works, this is one of those powerful texts. But some have suggested, both then and now, that Paul was advocating for throwing off the law and becoming that he was an antinomianist, which means against the law, which is not what he was. Because he noted that when we trust God, we fulfill the law. When we trust God, we obey. But it's not the law that makes us righteousness. It's our trust in God that makes us righteous. It is credited to us as righteous, not because we've earned it, but because we trusted in God. And before we deserved it, we were considered righteous. And then we obeyed him also because we trusted him. So this is a big part of what Paul is pointing out. Abraham had faith in God and therefore is also the father of all who belong to God by faith. I might have already read that one. F, the people thought that everything was changed from the way of salvation or right standing with God had been found in the past. So they thought that everything changed. So we used to get salvation by following the law. Now we get salvation by grace through faith. And Paul is changing that. Salvation, the way we receive salvation has not changed at all, other than the fact that we have one sacrifice for all and we don't have to make sacrifices year after year. Um, but salvation or right standing with God is still found in the same way. When God was really restoring through Christ the way of salvation that had been established with Abraham, from which they had strayed in order to follow the law instead. So that's the thing that Paul is pointing out, is that we're not changing the way you receive salvation. We're actually restoring it back to the way Abraham was saved, how Abraham was credited as having right standing with God. You are saved the same way Abraham was. When you put your trust in God, then you are in right standing with God, and people have strayed from that to follow the law instead of trusting God. Whereas following his commands because I trust in God is a very different thing than trying to receive salvation by following his commands without trusting in God, which is what a lot of people, I think, still do, honestly. Number two, in what ways did Abraham believe God? A, he was very old and never had children, but he believed that God would give him children because God, promised he would. And that is true. And that is pointed out in this text. B, he left the land of his family, went to a place God would take him without knowing where he was going. Um, 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 which God would show him. I think there's a missing piece there, which God would show him. He didn't know where he was going, but God said, "Go to the place I will show you." Um, C, although he knew Isaac was the child through God's promise, uh, would be through whom God's promise would be fulfilled, he still obeyed God's command to sacrifice him, reasoning that God could raise him from the dead if he wanted. So interestingly, B and C are really not talked about as much in this text as A, but if we follow Abraham's story, then it is consistent that if Abraham was trusting in God, specifically the way he thought God was going to provide, he would never have trusted God enough to go up on the mountain intending to sacrifice Isaac, because this was God's provision. How could I sacrifice God's provision in his promise? But he trusted God enough that he was willing to do that and believe that God would provide somehow. And God did. Number three, order the following statements according to which came first, second, and third. Um, Abraham's actions, God's promise, Abraham's faith. So this is an important theological discussion. This is an important theological. We got to get this right in order to really understand how salvation comes. So, B, God's promise came first. God always initiates relationship with us. God has always reached out to us first. So there's nothing we've done to reach out to him and earn salvation unless he has first done something to reach out to us. So God's promise came first. Second is Abraham's faith. Abraham trusted in that promise after God made the promise. So he responded in faith. He trusted in God. And then, Abraham's actions came third. And that's important. The actions are a symptom, the actions are a result of our trust in God's promise. And if we try to do the actions first, it doesn't work. It's not going to happen. Number 4, did Abraham act on his faith? Yes, no, explain. Absolutely. So actions are not thrown out. Just because they're third doesn't mean they don't exist. Just because they're third doesn't mean they're not a part of the process. Abraham acted on his faith. And if we go to the book of James, he says, you want proof that faith without deeds is dead? Show me your faith without actions, and I'll show you my faith by what I do. And so our faith is shown in what we do. Whether or not we have faith is shown in what we do. If Abraham had subsequently not went to sacrifice Isaac, if he had subsequently not followed God to the place he would show him, if he had not trusted that God would be faithful, then none of this would have happened. Right relationship, right standing with God would not have been there, because have shown that he did not trust God. But when he acted and followed God and obeyed God, it showed that he did trust God. So, really important. Number 5, who does verse 21 say that Abraham, or why does verse 20? See, sometimes I think the questions are written wrong, and sometimes I think I just can't read the questions right. And it is a little bit of both. That's the honest truth. Number 5, why does verse 21 say that Abraham did not waver in his faith? So verse 21 says, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he promised. So Abraham was fully persuaded that God had the power to do what he promised, and therefore he didn't waver in his faith. And so here's something to remember: if we are not fully persuaded that God has the power to do what he's promised, then when the test comes, when we have to choose what we're going to do, we will often choose to do things that show we don't trust in him, because we are not fully persuaded that he's able to do what he has promised. I was just thinking those words are included in an old hymn. I'm blanking on the most of the hymn, but and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I've committed unto him against that day. That's I have to look that up again. That's a great old hymn of the church. I love it. But are we persuaded that he is able to do what he has promised? Number 6, what are some things that God has promised us? We can go a lot of different directions with this question, but I would say let's start with the fact that he has promised us victory. That in John 14:12, he says, even greater things can you do because I go to the Father. He's told us that we can do the things that he has been doing, and even greater things can we do because he goes to the Father. So he's promised us victory. He's promised us power. He's promised us not power over people, power over sin and death. Power over the things that strength over temptations. In 1 Corinthians, it tells us that that no one is tempted beyond what they can bear, but God is faithful and he would provide a way out for us to stand up under it. So in other words, if you're being tempted and you think you're tempted and you can't help but give in, the truth is you can help, because he has promised that he wouldn't let you be tempted beyond what you could bear, but he is faithful and he'll provide a way out. So you have the opportunity to have victory over that temptation you're feeling, perhaps even right now, because of his promise, because of his power. You might say that I've heard from God in my life, and I have some promises that he has given me. I'll throw out a couple here. He called me into ministry, and he promised me he would take care of me and my family, and all of the worries and the thoughts of how I'm going to provide for my family and things like that. He has always answered. He's given me jobs when I needed jobs outside of the church. He's given me income through the church at times when he didn't want me working another job. He has, I I had fears of my children being I mean, this is pretty personal, I think, but I'll admit it here. Fears of my children sort of being overlooked or not getting all that they deserve to get as from me as a father, or from the opportunities for a great future. And God has given me, even when I'm working other jobs, he's given me time to be with them and spend time with them and the things that matter to them. He's made them active in the church, and feeling like I think it's their church and not just my church, and that they have a place in it. He's given them the opportunity to attend the academy with little or no input from us, because we could never have afforded that kind of education. And we are so blessed. And he's taken care of us. He has fulfilled those promises to me. And every now and then I worry still about the same things, but then I look back and remember that he has always been faithful to me. And so he will continue to be faithful in the future. I'm confident of it. I'm persuaded that he is able to do the things that he has promised to do in my life and in my family's life, in our church too. He's promised me things about the church that I believe that he will continue to fulfill. And number 7, what might it look like to receive those promises by faith? A, I claim it right now by faith. Now let's sit and see if it happens. So there's a couple things. One is those words are common in certain theological traditions that don't really match with what we believe. Um, we all have sort of joking, perhaps a little mocking perceptions of other theological traditions. Plenty of people have those about Nazarenes, I know. Um, but there's a tradition out there that is very faith healing oriented, and sort of um, prosperity occasionally oriented, and we say name it, claim it, grab it, stab it, and that this idea that all I got to do is say it out loud and I like have it. It's like mine, because God is sort of so faithful to just provide whatever it is I say out loud. And a couple things. One is I honestly don't believe that. I believe God is faithful, but I believe he's faithful to give me the things that I need and not always the things that I want. And I believe that a lot of times that theological tradition ends up with a lot of people thinking that God is going to provide them with a bunch of things that they want that they probably shouldn't have. And so I don't agree with that. I also don't agree that faith means we sit and wait for God to do something. B says, if God has promised, I believe it will happen. Although it seems like a waste of time to work towards something that is impossible, I choose to believe God and act on my belief, trusting that he will bring the miracle. So the difference is that although it seems like a waste of time to work towards something that's impossible. So if God promises something that seems impossible, a lot of us would rather sit there and just wait because we don't want to waste time because it actually seems impossible. So that's where faith, sort of this supposed faith tradition, comes into contact with actually not having faith is that a lot of times we're sitting there waiting for God, because then we don't look foolish if it doesn't come through. But if we've been working for a long time at building an ark, for an example, and then nothing happens and it doesn't start raining and there's no flood, then we look pretty foolish and we've wasted our life. Paul said, if Christ is not risen, if Christ is not who he said he was, then we are of all people foolish. Why? Because we put our whole life into following him, to obeying him, to doing the things that he said, to working toward the impossible sometimes. And I just want to go back to say, in case you don't believe this, go back and read the miracles of Jesus in the book of John. Go back and read the miracles that God has fulfilled. When he parted the sea, he parted it when the people put their foot. When the people in front put their foot in the water, it parted. Not before they put the foot in the water. They had to put their foot in the water. Naaman was healed when he decided to go wash in the river that he thought was dirty, and it didn't make sense that he would be healed there. The water was turned into wine after the people filled the big barrels, the big jugs with water, believing that something was about to happen. Um, the man that was healed had to actually get up and get up and take his mat and walk. He had to get up. He's tried to get up before, it didn't work. He wasn't able to walk after he got up. But when Jesus said it, he had to do it again. Um, you know, the man who came to get his child healed wanted Jesus to go back with him, but Jesus said, he's already healed. Just go back. Can you imagine if you traveled that far to get Jesus to heal your child, to go back empty handed and trust that he was really healed? Um, all of those things required somebody to actually do what Jesus said or do what God said. The miracles of God happen. Now, filling a jug with water does not make wine. Only Jesus could do that. But Jesus didn't do it until they expressed their faith by filling it with water. See, that's how we got to understand this. So, to receive the promises that have been given to us by faith, we've got to do it. Even if in other words, if God has promised us power over our lust, power over addiction to pornography, power over addiction to cigarettes, then what do we got to do? We've got to choose not to put that cigarette in our mouth. We've got to choose not to Google those sites. We've got to choose. And when it seems overwhelming and when it seems impossible, he will give us the strength and it will be possible. But we've got to trust and choose and step out in faith. Number 8, what is God calling you to do in faith, believing for God's miraculous promise? So what is it that he has promised you that you need to take a step of faith and trust that he's going to fulfill his promise? Maybe it's overcoming sinful habits in your life. Maybe it's staying in. When God tells me he's going to take care of me as I walk in ministry, I've got to stay in it instead of walking away or going to finding ways to provide for myself like I'm tempted to sometimes. I've got to stay in it and do what he tells me, which requires discernment, because I got to make sure that when he provides a job outside the church, that it's really him that provided it and called me to take it. Otherwise, that could have very easily been me applying for jobs. There are jobs that I have not applied for, that I have not pursued. every job that I've gotten when I've been while I've been in ministry has been one that seemed miraculous. This job that I have right now, I applied for it when he told me to, not before when I wanted it, not at other times. And within 3 hours, I had a call back for an interview. That doesn't happen. There were other times when I applied for things that you don't get ever get a call back. You do an interview and you never even find out the result because people don't even call you back. I know that didn't happen in this case because from the beginning I knew it was God. And he has shown me that he is in this throughout, because also there may be a time when it's time to not be at that job or whatever. Well, I better continue listening and following to know when he tells me that is going to be, and not keep trying to provide for myself. So what promises does he want to fulfill, and what is he calling you to do to step out?